Some warnings arrive with sirens. Others arrive on four silent paws, carried by instincts no machine can measure and no human can fully explain. The morning fog drifted low across the harbor outside Seattle, wrapping the passenger terminal in a pale gray veil that softened every light along the pier. The scent of salt water mingled with diesel fuel, fresh coffee, and rain-soaked cedar as travelers wheeled suitcases toward the massive white ferry preparing for its first departure across Puget Sound. Deckhands called out routine instructions while gulls circled overhead, their distant cries blending with the slow, mournful blast of the ship's horn. It looked like every ordinary travel morning America had seen 1,000 times before. That was exactly why no one noticed the danger waiting among them. Officer Ethan Walker adjusted the collar of his dark blue K-9 uniform as he stepped onto the boarding platform beside Atlas, the 6-year-old German shepherd whose calm amber eyes rarely missed anything. Ethan was 37, broad-shouldered, fair-skinned, with short brown hair beginning to show faint traces of gray near his temples after years spent first as a Marine and later protecting the nation's ports. His expression carried the quiet patience of someone who had learned that real emergencies rarely announced themselves with panic. Atlas walked close to his left leg without a leash pulling tight, every movement disciplined yet natural, ears turning toward sounds long before Ethan heard them himself. Together they had inspected thousands of passengers. Most mornings ended with nothing more dramatic than forgotten pocketknives or prohibited fireworks tucked into luggage. Ethan expected today to be no different. Families laughed as children raced toward the boarding ramp. Retirees compared vacation photos, and business travelers hurried while balancing coffee cups and rolling bags. Atlas moved steadily through the crowd, pausing only long enough to sample the invisible trail of scents drifting through the cool morning air. Then everything changed. Without warning, Atlas froze. His muscles stiffened beneath his sable coat. His ears locked forward. His breathing slowed. Ethan felt the subtle shift before the first sound escaped the dog's throat. Atlas stared at a large Navy suitcase resting beside a neatly dressed passenger waiting near the center of the boarding line. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, clean-cut, wearing a light gray jacket and polished leather shoes. Nothing about him invited suspicion. He stood patiently, occasionally glancing toward the ferry as though worried about missing departure. Atlas took one careful step forward, then another. Suddenly his deep bark shattered the peaceful rhythm of the terminal. Heads turned instantly. Conversation stopped. Atlas barked again, louder this time, refusing to break eye contact with the suitcase. Ethan placed a steady hand against the dog's shoulder. "Easy, partner," he whispered, though Atlas had never ignored a quiet command without reason. The German shepherd lowered his head, sniffed once more, and barked again with even greater urgency. Nearby passengers instinctively backed away from the luggage. A mother quietly pulled her young daughter behind her. A deck supervisor frowned toward Ethan while another security officer hurried across the platform. The passenger holding the suitcase blinked in visible confusion and slowly raised both empty hands. "Officer," he said carefully, "I don't understand. Is something wrong?" Ethan looked from the frightened faces around him to Atlas, whose eyes never moved from the bag. In 6 years together, his partner had never barked like this without believing that someone's life depended on being heard. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Even the gulls drifting above the ferry slipped into silence, as if the harbor itself were waiting for someone to explain what Atlas already believed. Ethan did not tighten his grip on the dog. He never needed to. Atlas stood firm, every muscle steady, his tail level, his amber eyes fixed on the Navy's suitcase with unwavering conviction. That was what unsettled Ethan most. This was not excitement. It was certainty. Officer Melissa Grant arrived first, her boots echoing softly across the damp boarding platform. 34 years old, fair-skinned, with blonde hair tucked neatly beneath her patrol cap, she glanced from the passenger to Atlas before meeting Ethan's eyes. "False alert?" she asked quietly. Ethan answered without looking away from the suitcase. "He has never given me this posture unless something feels wrong." Melissa studied Atlas for another moment. She had worked alongside the German shepherd for nearly 4 years and had seen him remain perfectly calm around loud crowds, crying children, fireworks, and construction equipment. The dog never wasted energy. If he barked, There was always a reason. The passenger swallowed nervously but remained cooperative. "My name is Benjamin Harper," he said, reaching slowly into his jacket. "My identification is in my wallet. May I take it out?" Ethan nodded once. "Slowly, please." Benjamin produced his driver's license and ferry ticket with careful movements. His hands trembled only slightly, the kind of nervousness anyone might feel while surrounded by uniformed officers and dozens of watching strangers. Melissa checked his identification through her handheld device. Within seconds, the screen returned a clean record. No warrants, no criminal history, no travel restrictions. Everything matched. Ethan crouched beside Atlas and gently rested one hand against the thick fur behind the dog's neck. "Talk to me," he whispered. Atlas answered by lowering his nose toward the pavement before lifting it again, drawing another long breath from the cool morning air. Instead of relaxing, he released another deep bark that echoed beneath the ferry's steel loading ramp. Several passengers instinctively stepped back another few feet. A little boy clutching a stuffed bear looked up at his father and asked, "Is the dog scared?" His father wrapped an arm around his shoulders and quietly replied, "No, buddy. I think he is trying to tell everybody something." Ethan felt those words settle heavily in his chest. Years earlier, during his final deployment as a Marine, Atlas had stopped outside an abandoned warehouse and refused to move forward despite repeated commands. Minutes later, engineers discovered a dangerous chemical leak inside the building. No alarm had sounded. No sensor had detected it in time. Only Atlas had known. Ethan had promised himself that morning never to dismiss the dog's instincts again. Melissa closed the identification scanner and handed Benjamin his license. "Everything checks out," she said softly. Around them, boarding had completely stopped. Deckhands exchanged uncertain glances while the ferry captain watched from the upper bridge through wide windows streaked with mist. The loudspeaker remained silent. No one wanted to create unnecessary fear. Yet no one wanted to ignore the warning standing on four paws either. Ethan slowly rose to his feet, his gaze returning to the untouched suitcase. He could not explain what Atlas sensed. He only knew one simple truth. His partner had never asked for trust without earning it first. Benjamin Harper looked from one officer to another, then back to the suitcase, standing quietly beside his polished shoes. Confusion had replaced the nervousness in his face. "You can search everything," he said, his voice steady despite the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. "I packed those clothes myself this morning. I have nothing to hide." Ethan nodded with quiet appreciation. Cooperation often revealed more about a person than words ever could. He motioned toward an empty inspection table positioned a safe distance from the waiting passengers. Two harbor security officers carefully rolled the Navy's suitcase across the damp concrete, while Atlas followed at Ethan's side, never blinking, never allowing his attention to drift. The morning breeze carried another wave of salty air through the terminal, fluttering travel brochures and ferry schedules taped beside the boarding gate. Somewhere beyond the fog, another ship sounded its horn, low and distant, reminding everyone that time continued moving even while this moment seemed frozen. Melissa unzipped the suitcase slowly. Folded shirts appeared first, stacked with remarkable care. Beneath them rested neatly pressed jeans, a navy sweater, toiletries sealed inside a clear travel pouch, a paperback novel, and a camera wrapped carefully inside a padded case. Everything looked ordinary. Every item matched the quiet personality Benjamin seemed to carry. Melissa examined each piece methodically while another officer scanned the interior lining with a portable detector. The display remained calm. No warning lights. No unusual readings. Ethan watched Atlas instead of the equipment. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still until the final shirt was lifted from the suitcase. Then his ears twitched. He leaned forward and inhaled deeply before releasing another sharp bark that echoed beneath the steel canopy. Melissa looked up from the empty luggage. "Nothing," she said softly. "It is completely clean." Benjamin released a slow breath that almost became a relieved laugh. "I told you. There has to be some mistake." Around them, whispers began spreading through the waiting crowd. A few passengers exchanged skeptical glances. One elderly man quietly muttered that even well-trained dogs could have bad days. Another traveler suggested the long shift might have tired the animal. Ethan heard every word but refused to answer any of them. Atlas had worked beside him through freezing rain, blistering summer heat, crowded sporting events, and countless inspections without losing focus. Fatigue had never sounded like this. Ethan knelt once more beside his partner. Atlas did not look at the empty suitcase now. Instead, his nose drifted toward the open air above it, following something invisible that no human could see. The dog's breathing became slower, almost thoughtful, as though sorting through hundreds of overlapping scents carried by the harbor wind. Then, without warning, Atlas turned away from the inspection table entirely. Gasps rose from nearby passengers as the German Shepherd began walking toward the boarding ramp, nose held high instead of low. He was no longer interested in the luggage. He was following a scent that continued beyond it. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had saved both of their lives years before. The suitcase had never been Atlas's destination. It had only been the place where the invisible trail began. Atlas moved with quiet determination, his paws clicking softly against the damp steel of the boarding ramp, while Ethan followed only a step behind. Melissa hesitated before calling after him. "Ethan, the inspection is finished. The suitcase is clear." He slowed just enough to answer without taking his eyes off his partner. "The suitcase may be clear. The scent is not." Atlas never hurried. That was another lesson Ethan had learned over years of working beside him. When the dog found something obvious, he became energetic. When the mystery ran deeper, he became almost patient, collecting invisible pieces that no human mind could assemble. The ferry's engines hummed beneath the deck, sending a faint vibration through the metal flooring. Travelers waited behind the security line, whispering among themselves while harbor employees exchanged uncertain glances. Some believed the inspection had already proved the dog mistaken. Others watched Atlas with growing curiosity, sensing that the morning was far from over. Benjamin Harper remained beside Melissa without protest. He looked toward Ethan with genuine concern rather than irritation. "Officer," he called quietly, "if my suitcase is not the problem, then why did your dog stop there?" Ethan answered honestly, "I do not know yet." The words settled over the terminal with surprising weight. Experienced officers rarely admitted uncertainty, but Ethan trusted truth more than pride. Atlas reached the entrance to the passenger deck and suddenly paused again. His nose lifted toward the cool air flowing through the open boarding doors. The wind had shifted. It carried the sharp scent of seawater, fresh paint, machine oil, hot coffee drifting from the onboard cafe, and hundreds of overlapping human scents from passengers already seated inside the vessel. Atlas ignored nearly all of them. His ears turned slightly toward the lower cargo level beneath the main passenger deck. He released a low rumble that Ethan recognized immediately. It was not a warning directed at a person. It was the sound Atlas made whenever he believed something important remained hidden just beyond sight. Harbor Supervisor Richard Collins approached with measured steps, his weathered face showing more concern than frustration. 58 years old and responsible for ferry operations for nearly 3 decades, he had learned to respect experienced officers without surrendering to unnecessary panic. "Walker," he said calmly, "boarding is already running behind schedule. Tell me what you need." Ethan watched Atlas carefully before answering. 5 more minutes." Collins looked toward the waiting passengers, then back to the motionless German Shepherd. Finally, he nodded once. "You have them." Atlas suddenly stepped away from the passenger entrance and angled toward a narrow service corridor leading below deck. The corridor was marked for authorized personnel only and connected to the machinery spaces, storage compartments, and cargo loading area beneath the ferry. Ethan felt the hairs along his arms rise beneath his uniform. The suitcase had simply crossed paths with whatever scent Atlas had captured. It had borrowed the trail for only a moment before carrying it into the crowded terminal. Now the dog was following that trail back to where it truly belonged, and with every quiet step beneath the ferry's steel frame, Ethan became more certain that the real story had not boarded with the passengers at all. It had been waiting inside the ship long before the first traveler arrived. The service corridor welcomed them with a quiet that felt almost sacred. Gone were the voices of waiting passengers and the rolling suitcases across polished concrete. Down here, only the steady hum of generators, the soft vibration of steel beneath their boots, and the distant rhythm of seawater brushing against the hull filled the air. Overhead lights cast long amber reflections across pipes and painted bulkheads, while the faint scent of machine oil mixed with cool ocean air drifting through hidden ventilation shafts. Atlas slowed until each step became deliberate. His nose traced invisible currents flowing through the corridor, occasionally lifting as though reading words carried by the breeze itself. Ethan loosened his grip on the lead, giving his partner room to work exactly as years of training had taught them. Behind them, Melissa and Supervisor Collins followed at a respectful distance, careful not to interrupt the dog's concentration. None of them spoke above a whisper. Even ordinary sounds seemed louder beneath the ferry's steel frame. Atlas reached an intersection where one hallway descended toward the cargo deck, while another continued toward maintenance storage. He stopped completely. His ears flicked once toward the cargo level, then turned back toward the ventilation duct running overhead. Ethan watched every movement with practiced patience. The German Shepherd inhaled deeply before pivoting toward a narrow maintenance access door marked authorized personnel only. Atlas placed one paw against the closed door without scratching or barking. He simply stood there, breathing slowly. Ethan glanced at Collins. "What is behind this room?" Collins answered after a moment of thought. "Ventilation controls, electrical panels, and equipment storage. Only maintenance crews use it before departure." Melissa stepped closer. "No passengers?" Collins shook his head. "Never." Ethan nodded quietly. "Can you unlock it?" Collins removed a ring of keys from his belt. The old brass key turned with a soft metallic click before the heavy door eased open. Cool air rolled into the hallway, carrying a sharper scent of fresh paint, cleaning solution, warm electrical equipment, and something else so faint Ethan could not identify. Atlas immediately entered the room, moving between shelves lined with toolboxes, spare filters, and neatly stacked maintenance supplies. He ignored everything until he reached a large ventilation intake near the rear wall. There he froze once again. His nose remained fixed on the metal grate, while his breathing slowed into the same careful rhythm Ethan remembered from countless successful searches. Melissa examined the room with her flashlight. Everything appeared perfectly organized. No signs of forced entry. No damaged equipment. No abandoned packages. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet Atlas quietly whined for the first time that morning, a soft sound so unlike his confident bark that Ethan felt an unexpected chill. This was not fear. It was urgency. The dog lowered his head, then looked directly into Ethan's eyes before turning back toward the vent. That brief glance said more than any command ever could. Atlas was not asking Ethan to trust the room. He was asking him to trust what lay beyond it. Ethan stepped closer to the ventilation grate and noticed something almost too small to matter. Caught along one corner of the metal mesh rested a single dark blue thread, nearly identical in color to Benjamin Harper's suitcase. By itself it meant nothing. But in Ethan's experience, the smallest clues often marked the beginning of the largest truths. Supervisor Collins studied the tiny blue thread for several long seconds before slipping on a pair of protective gloves and carefully lifting it free from the edge of the ventilation grate. It was no longer than an inch, ordinary enough that most people would have brushed it away without a second thought. Yet Ethan noticed Atlas watching every movement with complete focus. The German Shepherd did not celebrate. He did not relax. His ears remained forward, his posture unchanged, as though the thread was only another quiet piece of a much larger puzzle. Collins held the fiber beneath the bright maintenance light. "This matches the passenger's suitcase almost perfectly," he said. Melissa frowned. "But how does luggage leave a thread inside a restricted maintenance room?" No one answered immediately. The question lingered in the cool mechanical air while the steady rhythm of engines echoed through the steel walls. Ethan stepped closer to the ventilation intake and looked beyond the metal grate. The narrow duct disappeared into darkness before bending toward the lower sections of the ferry. Fresh air drifted steadily through it, carrying faint traces of machine oil, sea salt, warm electrical equipment, and something else that Atlas continued to follow with unwavering attention. "This scent did not start with the suitcase," Ethan said quietly. "The suitcase only crossed its path." Collins slowly nodded, meaning whatever Atlas detected may already be somewhere inside this ship. The realization settled over the room with unexpected weight. Melissa reached for her radio. "If that is true, we should pause boarding until we understand what we are dealing with." Collins hesitated only briefly before making the difficult decision every supervisor hoped never to face. He pressed the emergency operations button clipped to his belt. Moments later, a calm announcement echoed across the ferry terminal. Passengers were informed that boarding would be temporarily delayed because of an operational safety inspection. The message remained measured and professional, avoiding any language that might create unnecessary fear, yet confusion spread quickly through the waiting crowd. Travelers looked toward the vessel, whispered among themselves, and checked their watches. Crew members quietly secured access points, while additional harbor officers moved into position around the loading area. No alarms sounded. No one ran. Even so, the atmosphere changed completely. The ordinary excitement of departure gave way to cautious uncertainty. Ethan appreciated the restraint. Calm decisions often protected people better than loud ones. Atlas suddenly lifted his head higher than before. His nose searched the moving air flowing through the duct, then turned toward another maintenance passage leading deeper beneath the passenger deck. Without waiting for a command, he walked several careful steps before stopping once more. This time he did not bark. Instead, he glanced back at Ethan, then toward the narrow corridor ahead. It was the silent invitation that had guided them through countless successful searches over the years. Melissa noticed it too. He wants us to keep following. Ethan smiled faintly, the first hint of confidence returning to his tired face. No, he replied softly. He wants us to stop looking where we expect the answer to be. He rested one reassuring hand against Atlas's shoulder before taking another step into the quiet passage below deck. Somewhere ahead, hidden behind steel walls and humming machinery, the invisible trail continued, and with every breath the faithful German shepherd drew from the cool harbor air, the mystery came one step closer to revealing itself. Atlas continued through the narrow passage with the calm confidence of a partner who had already solved the mystery but lacked the words to explain it. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting pale reflections across polished pipes that disappeared into the belly of the ferry. Every few seconds the vessel answered with its own quiet language, the steady vibration of engines warming to full power, the distant splash of waves against the hull, and the faint metallic creak that every seasoned sailor accepted as perfectly ordinary. Ethan matched Atlas's pace without speaking. After years together, he had learned that silence often revealed more than conversation. Melissa followed several steps behind, while Supervisor Collins contacted the engineering crew, quietly requesting access to every maintenance compartment connected to the central ventilation system. No one rushed. No one panicked. The comm itself became part of the investigation. Atlas stopped beside another heavy steel door marked environmental control equipment. Unlike the previous room, this one was secured by an electronic lock that only engineering supervisors could access. Collins held his identification card against the reader, and the green light flashed almost immediately. As the door eased open, a wave of warm air rolled into the corridor carrying the familiar scent of motors, electrical equipment, and filtered seawater. Atlas entered without hesitation. The room stretched farther than Ethan expected. Large ventilation units lined one wall, while rows of insulated ducts disappeared into the ceiling above. Digital control panels blinked steadily, each screen reporting normal operating conditions. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet Atlas ignored the machinery completely. He walked past the humming equipment until he reached a stack of replacement air filters waiting to be installed during the ferry's next scheduled maintenance period. There he stopped, lowered his nose, and gently nudged one unopened cardboard box. Ethan knelt beside him and noticed something unusual. A faint line of gray dust rested along the edge of the box, even though the surrounding floor had been cleaned recently. Melissa looked closer. "That dust does not belong here," she whispered. Collins nodded slowly. "These filters arrived yesterday afternoon. The storage room was cleaned after delivery." Ethan carefully moved the lightweight box aside. Beneath it lay a narrow maintenance hatch built into the floor, almost invisible beneath the protective coating of industrial paint. Collins frowned with surprise. "That access panel should never be covered. It leads to the lower ventilation junction." He released the latch and slowly lifted the hatch. Cool air drifted upward from the narrow service space below. Atlas immediately leaned forward, inhaled once, and then looked back at Ethan with quiet certainty. There was no barking now. He had reached the place he had been searching for since the moment he stopped beside Benjamin Harper's suitcase. Ethan switched on his flashlight and directed the beam into the opening. The narrow compartment contained little more than pipes, wiring, and an inspection platform. Then something caught the edge of the light. Tucked safely against the far corner rested a compact, insulated maintenance bag bearing no company logo and no identification tag. It had been positioned carefully where routine inspections could easily overlook it unless someone deliberately opened the hidden access panel. Melissa drew a slow breath. That does not belong here. Collins quietly agreed. None of my crews use bags like that. Following established safety procedures, Ethan signaled for the specialized harbor response team already waiting nearby. Within minutes, trained technicians carefully examined the unattended bag. They quickly determined that it contained no explosive materials, no weapons, and nothing intended to harm passengers. Instead, the bag held several unauthorized electronic communication devices, signal repeaters, counterfeit maintenance identification badges, and detailed diagrams of restricted sections of the ferry and neighboring port facilities. The room fell silent for an entirely different reason. This was never about a single passenger carrying suspicious luggage. Someone had secretly hidden equipment inside the ferry itself, using ordinary travelers and crowded departures to conceal repeated unauthorized access. Benjamin Harper's suitcase had unknowingly brushed against the same hidden scent while passing through the terminal, allowing Atlas to detect a trail no human eye could ever have followed. Ethan rested one grateful hand against Atlas's broad neck as the faithful German shepherd gazed quietly toward the open hatch. Once again, the dog had reminded everyone in that silent steel room that truth sometimes leaves the faintest footprints, and only unwavering loyalty has the patience to follow them all the way home. The discovery transformed the morning without a single raised voice. Harbor response specialists carefully documented every item inside the concealed maintenance bag, while technicians secured the hidden compartment for further examination. Boarding remained paused, but the atmosphere that had once carried uncertainty now carried quiet purpose. Every officer understood that Atlas had uncovered something far more important than an unattended suitcase. He had revealed a hidden vulnerability before it could grow into something far more serious. Supervisor Collins stood silently beside the open hatch, his weathered face reflecting years of responsibility. In 28 years working these ferries, he said softly, I have never seen anyone find a compartment like this through instinct alone. Ethan smiled faintly without taking his eyes off Atlas. It was never instinct alone. It was training, trust, and a partner who refuses to ignore what the rest of us cannot sense. Melissa watched technicians compare the unauthorized identification badges with official maintenance records. Several names did not belong to any current employee, and timestamps recovered from the communication devices suggested repeated unauthorized activity over several weeks. Investigators quietly began reviewing security footage while additional officers checked nearby service areas for similar signs of tampering. Every new discovery confirmed the same truth. The hidden equipment had been placed carefully over time, concealed in locations that ordinary inspections rarely reached. None of it would have been noticed that morning if Atlas had not followed a single invisible scent drifting from Benjamin Harper's suitcase after it unknowingly brushed against the contaminated air inside the terminal. Benjamin himself was invited below deck after officers confirmed once again that he had committed no wrongdoing. He listened carefully as Ethan explained what had happened. Relief washed across his face, followed by disbelief. So my suitcase was only carrying a trace? He asked quietly. Ethan nodded. For a few moments, yes. It borrowed a scent that belonged somewhere else. Benjamin looked toward Atlas, who now rested calmly beside Ethan with his tail gently sweeping across the steel floor. The passenger slowly knelt several feet away, careful not to interrupt the working dog. Thank you, he whispered. You protected people who will never even know your name. Atlas answered only by blinking once before turning his attention back toward Ethan, as though praise had never been part of the job. Outside, the morning fog began lifting from Puget Sound. Sunlight broke through the clouds in thin golden ribbons that shimmered across the water and reflected against the white hull of the waiting ferry. The harbor slowly awakened once again. Crew members resumed their duties with renewed confidence, while families waiting inside the terminal chatted quietly, unaware of how close the morning had come to following a very different path. Ethan stepped onto the open vehicle deck with Atlas beside him and drew a long breath of cool salt air. He rested one hand against the German shepherd's broad shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath the sable coat. Years earlier, he had promised never to doubt the silent warnings carried in those faithful amber eyes. Today that promise had protected not only a single partner, but an entire community of strangers preparing for an ordinary journey across the water. Sometimes the greatest victories leave behind no headlines, no dramatic celebrations, and no visible scars. Sometimes they leave only grateful hearts, quiet waters, and one loyal dog who simply did what he believed was right. By early afternoon, the ferry finally eased away from the dock, its wake unfolding across the calm blue waters of Puget Sound beneath a sky that had traded gray clouds for gentle sunlight. Most of the passengers never learned why their departure had been delayed. They carried coffee to the observation deck, pointed cameras toward distant snow-capped mountains, and smiled as children laughed beside the railings. To them, it was simply another peaceful crossing. Ethan Walker preferred it that way. The finest days in public service were often the ones when ordinary people never realized how quietly they had been protected. Atlas sat beside him near the forward deck, the cool breeze lifting the thick sable fur around his neck while his amber eyes drifted across the endless water. There was no tension left in his posture now. The invisible trail had ended. The work was finished. Supervisor Richard Collins approached, carrying 2 steaming paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Ethan before resting both hands against the polished railing. "The investigators confirmed it," he said softly. "Those hidden devices have already helped uncover a larger operation that has been quietly exploiting restricted maintenance access at several coastal facilities. We would never have started looking there today without your partner." Ethan glanced down at Atlas, who remained peacefully focused on the distant horizon where sunlight danced across the rolling waves. "He deserves the credit," Ethan replied. Collins smiled. "He would never ask for it. That is exactly why he deserves it." A few minutes later, Benjamin Harper stepped onto the deck, carrying his camera. He hesitated before walking toward Ethan. "Would it be all right if I took one photograph?" he asked. "Not for the news. Just for myself. I want to remember the dog who changed the course of this morning." Ethan looked at Atlas, who calmly wagged his tail once before sitting a little straighter. Benjamin smiled through grateful eyes and quietly captured a single photograph. No dramatic pose. No ceremony. Just a faithful German shepherd sitting beside the man he trusted most while the ferry crossed calm American waters beneath an open sky. Benjamin lowered the camera and whispered, "Some heroes never need to speak." He walked away without another word. Ethan gently rubbed the space behind Atlas's ears where the old leather working collar rested against his neck. The dog leaned slightly into the familiar touch before lifting his nose toward the clean ocean breeze. It carried only salt, cedar, and the promise of another ordinary day. Ethan thought back to the first bark that had interrupted the peaceful morning hours earlier. One sound had caused confusion. One decision to trust had revealed the truth. The lesson felt larger than police work or investigations. Trust was built one faithful choice at a time, and sometimes the quietest voice in the room carried the greatest wisdom. As the ferry continued across the sound, the sunlight stretched into long golden ribbons upon the water, and the cries of distant gulls slowly faded behind them. Ethan rested both hands upon the railing while Atlas settled comfortably at his feet, content simply to remain beside the person he had chosen long ago. Neither expected applause. Neither needed recognition. They shared something far greater than medals or headlines. They shared the unspoken promise that whatever tomorrow carried, they would face it together. And perhaps that is how the smallest miracles usually arrive, not with thunder, not with celebration, but through steady hearts, faithful companions, and the quiet courage to listen when loyalty gently asks us not to look away.